This is Julianne Condia, host of Rewritten. Thank you so much for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hi, this is Emily.
This is Lindsay.
And this is Elizabeth,
co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Once you are done with this episode, we hope you'll come check out our show, Beauties and Headcanons, where we talk nerdy to you about fandoms, fan fiction, and all pop culture for nerds that you can think of. A new show comes out every Friday.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. Find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. This podcast is brought to you by Public House Media. We're going to jump right into our word of the week because I think that I'm not going to have enough time to talk, which probably means I'm only going to go for 15 minutes. The word of the week is ruminate. This is a pretty I think it's a common word, but who knows? Who knows? So what you usually think ruminate means is think about deeply, unless you're a farmer. Ruminate also means chew the cud. Now, cud is a really weird word. So when I started to when I started to look this word up, I already knew what this word meant. I already knew what ruminate meant in both ways, but as I started to look some stuff up and I wanted to find out more and how it worked, I actually learned what cud meant. I always knew the word cud, but I didn't know exactly what it meant. So if you don't know what chewing the cud is, it's what cows do. So this is how it works. So a cow eats grass. It chews the grass, and then it swallows the grass. Now there is something called a rumen, and all the rumen is a stomach. Okay, so what happens is the rumen partially digests that grass. Then the cow regurgitates it, pukes it back up, goes back in its mouth. The regurgitated grass is called cud, and the cow chews on that, and then it swallows it again. I don't know how many times it swallows and pukes it back up before it actually eats it, but that's, I guess, how cows and other types of farm animals are able to eat grass, because you can't eat grass as a human. Have you ever seen a dog eat grass and they puke it up? I'm not sure why they do it. So that's what ruminate means. So ruminate means think about deeply, but it has more of a pastoral, as in farmer, a reason, a more rural reason, which means that you chew something and then you swallow it, then you puke it back up, chew it some more. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll maybe I will tell you how many times a cow chews and then pukes the stuff back up. But I like the word because it makes you thinking. It makes a lot of sense to say that when you are thinking about something deeply, because it kind of feels like you are throwing something out multiple times, and then you're kind of looking at it from different angles. So that is our word of the week. So next time you are thinking about something different, deeply, not differently, you can say I'm ruminating about it. It is the 4th of July. I know that not everyone who listens to this show is from the United States, but I am. So since it's falling on the 4th of July, our Accidental Essence is going to focus on kind of the American spirit. And when I talk, so this is a holiday where I'm from. So if I was from another country, the holidays that I fall on, I'd probably be usually doing something about those. The reason, if this podcast episode did not fall on the 4th of July, I probably wouldn't be doing a 4th of July episode, because I usually don't when they don't fall on the exact day. But since this podcast episode is falling on the 4th of July and I am from the United States, we're going to do an episode on just like the American way of, I guess, literature thinking. It's more of it's not the zeitgeist, because zeitgeist doesn't work, because zeitgeist is the spirit of the times, and there's been multiple spirits of the different times in American history. And in this, I'm not trying to downplay any other countries. I'm not trying to be like, oh, this country is this country's so much better and you suck. I think that there are certainly things that are better, that are the United States does better, and I think there's certain things that other countries do better as well. Now, I don't live in the context of those other countries. There is a tendency for people to see their country as better than others, And I'm going to try not to do that. I'm not trying to paint another country in a different light. Also, because of the fact that, so there's a lot of different countries on Earth, and there's a lot of different types of cultures. And actually, I'm going to talk about two things. So first, I'm going to be focusing on the United States in relation to Europe, because those are the closest parallels for the countries that that's the closest country it is to. Okay, if that makes sense. Those are the closest countries that are parallel, that are an analog to the United States. If I compared the United States and how it does things to China, there'd be tons and tons and tons of differences. But since there's a lot of similarities already, I'm just going to be pointing out the differences to exemplify the ways that the Americans do things that are different. So when you think about, I've been reading a bit about this. I actually read, there's this Atlantic article by a Frenchman from 1939 that talks about the American, the way Americans do things, or the American spirit, essentially. And I'm going to link that in the show notes, but it's very, very long. It's very interesting, but it's very long. But it's interesting having that. And actually, he predicts some things, he puts down some predictions that I think may have come true. So when we think about Americans, some different things come to mind. You have pioneers, rebels, looking at the future optimistically. I think one of the things that really defines Americans generally is the fact that other countries will be like, yeah, Americans are more optimistic. I put up a post on, and I'll link this as well. I put up a post on, Facebook. That was a YouTube video. So I put up a YouTube video on Facebook. And the YouTube video is Ricky Gervais. That's how you say his name. If you don't know, just FYI. Ricky Gervais. And now I'm doubting that that's actually how you say his name. And he was talking about how the American office and the British office, the television show, is different because the Americans are more optimistic. So they view things in a little different way, and they have this viewpoint that you can be the president even if you are born just in a trailer, essentially. And then he's like, yeah, and to a certain, in Britain, we kind of view it as you're where you're at, and that's where you're at, and don't expect anything good to happen to you. So there's that optimism there. Along with that, there's a historical sense of destiny. If you have the manifest destiny, I don't know how much this plays into, I'll comment on this a second. I think this does play into the United States right now, because I think there's a lot of people, especially people who are more religious, who maybe not now, but in the near past, is that the way you say it, I guess? In the near past, people had a sense that the United States was, there was God was doing something in the world, and that brought about the United States. Now that could, very well be the case, right? So if there's a God, I think there is. If there's a God, and that God can pretty much do whatever that God wants, right? And it doesn't matter. And you'd expect, if that God was intimately involved in the world, you'd expect things to happen in the world that would connect to countries and different things like that. Okay, so from that perspective, I guess it could happen. Also, there's capitalism. So capitalism is a big thing in the United States. There's a lot of focus on that. Risk takers, fear of authority and government. And this kind of stems from the very founding of the United States, right? So the United States, if you go back to the founding fathers, England was governing the colonists without the colonists' permission, like without asking them or without having representation in the English government. So the colonists are like, no, this isn't going to happen. We won't take this. King George, I think they addressed everything to King George. I don't know if everything was his fault. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not going to say one way or the other. But because of that, the United States has been a country, and you can look back at the founding fathers. They've been they've tried to limit the power of one individual or one group of people. If you look at it, because the United States bureaucracy, or the United States government, because I think it's a little different than bureaucracy. The United States government, how it's set up, is, I honestly think that it's meant for gridlock. Like, it's meant that nobody can get anything done unless everybody agrees, which nothing's ever going to get done. So I think that it's pretty much limiting change at all costs is what they set up. But I think the United States has a fear of authority and a fear of government, but really a fear of a small group of people gaining power. That's why we have checks and balances in the government. Also, the United States is very Christian. I just found this out, and it makes sense, and I guess I kind of knew it. But most countries that are poor are more religious. Religiosity is higher in poorer countries, but the United States is an outlier among all different developed, really rich countries. It's very much more religious than any other rich country. It's a very rich country. You could argue that the United States is the richest country in the world. Actually, I will say it. I think the United States is the richest country in the world. If you want to argue against me with that, I will find sources and show you why it is, because I'm pretty sure that won't be hard to back up. It's a really big country, and we're fat. So I've just spent 10 minutes explaining like the basic thing. But I just want to dig into a little of different art. I think art is really important. Last week that's something else. I'm getting everything mixed up. I wrote a blog post about art and how it's about the expression of a person, and how it's important that even if you don't think your art's really valuable, that you do something if you want to, because it's not just about people who are really good at something doing things. It's about human experience. So I'm going to be talking about art because I think that can reveal more about this American character. And for those of you, if there's anybody who either speaks Spanish, because most South American countries and Middle American countries, most South American countries speak Spanish, and they have this idea that the Americas are all of the Americas, which makes sense. Okay, I say American, and the reason why we say American in the United States is because either you have to say American of the United States, because it's the United States of America. You could do United Statesian, but that doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to say an American of the United States, because we live in the United States of America. Therefore, we're taking the last word of that, and we're using it as what we call ourselves. Okay, or you could call yourselves United States of Americanites, but it's really, really long. It's just shorter. That's why we do it. So we're going to look at American literature and then British literature. And like I said, I'm going to be focusing on America as opposed to Europe. And not because other countries don't play a role in the world and other countries don't have a huge impact on the world. It's just a matter of the United States is the closest to Europe. So showing how they're different from Europe is going to best show how they're different than everybody else as well. Because comparing them to China, comparing them to an African country, you're of course going to find tons and tons of different things, but you have to start with something that is closer to, kind of to parse it out. So these are British authors, or British works of art, works of literature, I should say. And I'm just going to read through them, and then after I read through them, I'll talk about them a bit. So you've got Edgar Allan Poe in 1829, and then you've got Frankenstein in 1818. So Mary Shelley in 1818. We've got Walt Whitman in 1855, which is the American author. So the first one's always the American author. Tennyson is in the 1850s as well. So he's the British author. We've got Huckleberry Finn written in 1884, which is American, and then Treasure Island written in 1882. And if you notice, I tried to make the books a little more close together. They're similar books. We've got Fahrenheit 451, and then we've got 1984, and they're written around the same time. I actually don't have their dates. I'm a little disappointed in that. But if you look, so we've got Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Huck Finn, Fahrenheit 451. A couple of them are books, a couple of them are people. Those are the American authors. And we've got the British authors. We got Mary Shelley, Tennyson, Treasure Island, which is Robert Louis Stevenson, and 1984, which is George Orwell. And if you look at these two, because we're sharing the same language, right? When you talk about the British authors, I think there is more formality when it comes to the British authors than the authors in the United States, okay? I think the authors in the United States are a little looser than the British authors. Now, to show you this difference, I'm not going to focus on everything, but I think that what most exemplifies this is the difference between Tennyson and Walt Whitman. And I hope I'm saying Tennyson right, because I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. I'm going to just read you a little poem from each of them and show you the difference. So I know the Walt Whitman was extreme, but you got to think about this. Like, could any other country create a Walt Whitman? Could any other culture create a Walt Whitman? Putting him in here. And why does that country create a Walt Whitman? And I'm going to actually start with Tennyson. And the reason why I'm going to start with him is because it's more traditional. And I want you to kind of get your mind into the poetry get into the poetry mindset, I'm sorry. And then I want you to hear Walt Whitman and how it changes it. And these days, this isn't revolutionary. What's going on isn't revolutionary anymore because it's already been done. Once something's done, it's not revolutionary anymore. So if you are someone who's like, I like writing free verse, and I think free verse is so great because it's so boundary breaking, you haven't broken any boundaries anymore because it's already been done. So we'll jump into to Tennyson. I'm sorry, I get really, really distracted. All right, so this is Tennyson's Break, Break, Break. It goes, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It takes a while. Break, break, break on thy cold gray stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well, for the fisherman's boy, that he with his sisters at play. Oh, well, for the sailor lad, that he sings in his boat on the bay, and the stately ships go on, sorry about that, to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. So that's part of Break, Break, Break by Tennyson. Now, that is, if you imagine it in a British accent, you probably get it right away. And it makes sense. Like, it sounds like regular poetry. Now, here is the Song of the Open Road by Walt Whitman. Okay? Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me. The long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. Henceforth I ask not good fortune, I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing. Done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms. Strong and content I travel the open road. The earth that is sufficient, I do not want the constellations any nearer. I know they are very well where they are. I know they suffice for those who belong to them. Okay, so I'm not going to finish. It's not very long, but you don't need to hear the whole thing. You can go read it. So that's called, again, that one is called Song of the Open Road I. Okay, that's what the song is called. So they're very, very different. You've got to imagine, okay, what I think about, and I'm kind of in this mindset too, what I think about is there should be structure to what you do. There should be rules to what you do. And once you know those rules, you should be able to break them, right? It makes sense to me. Imagine taking that poem and going into England at the same exact time period. I bet you that the English, especially in the literary world, would be like, what are you doing? This isn't poetry. This is actually really bad. But at the same time in the United States, I don't know how famous Walt Whitman was, but at the same time in the United States, you could, what am I trying to say? In the United States, Walt Whitman was able to publish his poetry and he became a American classic. Now, I'm not a big fan of Walt Whitman. I haven't done a lot of reading of him, though, so I haven't given him a fair shake. But we're going to move on. So we're going to talk about American art. And I'm actually going to link, there's 2 sites I'm going to link. I'm going to link America's top artists that are from a site. It's not my collection, it's somebody else's, and top artists from France. And if you actually want to see what I see, you should look at both of these because it just shows different types of artists from these 2 countries. And again, I'm not doing Britain again. This is France. So what I've noticed about these 2 is that in French, for the French artists, they're a lot subtler. Okay, they're a lot subtler than artists from the United States. They're more artistic in the way that you expect. Okay, so I kind of compare them to classical music versus someone who is experimenting with 2 genres and mixing them together. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what I see, and that's the best description I can give them. I really think I can't show them in the podcast, but I really think that it would really help you to just pull up both of these. I'll have them in the show description. Pull up both of these, and you can see, okay, here's the American artist, here's the French artist. So like I said, more artistic in what's traditionally seen as artistic. They're not, they don't have a sharp, visceral meaning, but they have a subtle meaning to them. They're more gentle, if you will, from the French artists. Now, America's artists look a lot more experimental from this list. Just look at them both. They're from the same website, so I think that it's probably the same group of people putting them together and then being like, oh, these are what is coming out. They're a lot more visceral, American artists. And I'm not saying that French artists can't be visceral. I'm not saying that European artists can't be visceral, But I think that because you have stuff like Picasso stuff is visceral, I guess, but it's in a subtle way. It's in a way that's different. It's almost like French. So think of it this. Here's another metaphor, because we talked about metaphors 2 weeks ago. Here's a metaphor for American art, French art. So French art is like a whisper. So you got like the French artist, and he's kind of his art is whispering to you. It's telling you little things like this, and the American artist is like this, yelling at you. That's kind of what I feel like. Okay, so I hope I didn't blow anybody's eardrums. And then actually I wanted to talk about a few things about differences between Americans and Europeans, and then I'm going to talk about America's connection to one specific country that isn't a European country, and why I think it might actually work. So this is from Pew, so I think it's fairly credible, right? Credible. I think Pew is fairly credible. So I'll just try to lay this out as well as I can. So Americans believe they have more control over their destiny. Okay, they value individual liberty, whereas Europeans value that no one is in need, and they do this via the state. So this is from Pew. So don't argue with me about what it's saying. You can argue with Pew about what they're coming across with this. I didn't get to see all their data. Americans also have more tolerance for offensive speech, which connects back to that very visceral, in-your-face type of thing, huh? Also, it's the case that Americans are louder, and it might be the case that our accent makes us louder, or it may be the case that we're just louder in general, okay? That's one complaint that Europeans have when we go to Europe. So they're more tolerant for offensive speech against different types of people. And then religion is less important in Europe. Okay? So that kind of, I think that really, if you look at those different things, there's definitely a distinction. And I'm not going to be talking about the European side a lot. I'm going to be talking about the American side. But one country that I think it's really interesting that America gets along with it that so well. And I think that you have to look back through the history. So the country I'm talking about is Japan. And I've kind of lost my train of thought. I kind of lost my train of words there. I'm talking too quickly. So if you know the history of Japan, actually Japan has some parallels to the United States in some interesting ways. So the United States is a huge country, and Japan is an island. And it's a fairly big island, actually. I believe it's about as long as the western coast of the United States, if you actually show it on a map. It's a pretty stinking long island, or the eastern coast, one of the two. Japan was very isolationist, and I don't think I think to a certain degree it was because it was an island. To a certain degree, it's because I think the Japanese people or the rulers of Japan chose to allow themselves to be isolated. And the United States has traditionally been set apart and isolated from other countries as well. The United States in World War I didn't want to go into the war, and even now you've got political things talking about how the United States doesn't want to deal with certain things. There's certain people in the United States who want to be involved in foreign politics, but there's also a group of people who still talk about how we shouldn't get involved in the rest of the world's affairs unless it actually directly affects the United States. So there's that vein of that in there. And another aspect, so one thing, and this is something, my brother wrote a book. So my brother was in the Marines, and he was in Iraq twice. And he wrote a book about his first time, like a memoir of his first time. And he's a history teacher, so he's really into history, and it was a very interesting book. He should actually put it out, because he has like a draft, he has not a draft, I can't remember the stupid word, but you know what I'm talking about. He has the book, he should just put it out. He should just upload it to Amazon and let people read it, because and if he ever does, I will link it somewhere and tell you should go read it. So but he talks about it from a historical perspective, and he talks about the history of the Marines, because he was in the Marines, so he kind of ties it back to the history of the Marines, and he ties it back to this idea. The Marines are a very elite force in the United States military. They're not the most elite. I wouldn't say they're the most elite, but they're the biggest elite. They're the biggest force that is very rigorous in their training, that puts someone on the battlefield, like puts people on the battlefield in droves, right? It's not like you have the Navy SEALs, but it's special operations, so you're not fighting battles with the Navy SEALs. So the Marines are very, very well trained, and if you look at the different training of different groups, you can see that. And if you put them head to head up against other groups in the United States, it's just different. And people go into that. I can't remember the word. People go into the Marines, because they want to be tested. A lot of people do, because there's authors. There's a guy, Eugene Sledge. He wrote a memoir about World War II, and he went into the Marines partially because he wanted to go and be the best at fighting. But he talks about how in World War II, the Marines and the Japanese are very similar because there was a lot of honor in what they like, how they viewed things, and they had a big historical tradition. So the Japanese had the samurai and stuff like that, which is cool. Which it is cool. Like it sounded like that was, oh, that's cool, whatever. But the Japanese had the samurai. The Marines also had this history going back into before the United States was founded, and they had all this. They carried all this tradition with them. So my brother talks about how the Marines were, the Japanese and the Marines were kind of an equivalent fighting force, and they were kind of meeting their match. Both of them their match because they were so dedicated to what they were doing, and they were willing to die for what they were doing. But I think that it goes further. I think it goes further because the Japanese and the United States have a very, very close relationship. It's actually really, really interesting because I don't think they're the exact same at all. I just think that their cultures complement one another. The United States is a very loose culture. The United States is a very loose culture that's like, we're doing whatever and we're doing this and that. And I think that they are very willing to try a lot of different things. And I'm going to get into what the American spirit is. I'm going to try to define it for you in a little bit. But the Japanese culture traditionally is very honor-based. I don't think the United States culture is very honor-based. And for whatever reason, there's certain things that are very distinct. There's an excellence. There's a Japanese excellence, I would say. And it probably goes too far, right? It probably goes too far because of the fact that there's a lot of people, there's tons and tons of people killing themselves in Japan. But there's also like the idea of an American excellence, right? And I think because of that, and because Japan has this culture of honor and excellence, and there's a lot probably more to Japan that I don't know about that makes Japan and the United States able to be such good allies, have such good relations. But I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is because in World War II, the United States was like, well, we've got to do something, and they're like, well, we either have to invade Japan or we have to drop a nuclear bomb on Japan. And they decided to drop a nuclear bomb on Japan. And because of the Japanese culture, I wonder what the Japanese leadership thought. I wonder if they thought, these people are really, really serious about what they're doing. And the Japanese eventually are like, well, we're really serious about what we're doing too. So maybe it worked out. I don't know. No, not the bomb dropping, but like maybe because of how like all the interactions between the two, like after the war, they were able to flip back. They're like, well, it's all about honor in the end. Like, and maybe it's more because of the Japanese and the United States. I don't really know. I'd love to look into that sometime. But I just want to I've talked a lot about it. I've talked around it, but I want to just define what I think what an American is, or what the American character is, because I think there is a distinct character to it. There's this joke that the United States doesn't have a culture. There's actually a joke that it's like, oh, what's the difference between a petri dish or something like that and America? And it's like, well, if you leave a petri dish alone for 7 months, it'll develop a culture. But America does have a culture. It's just different than what you typically see. So this is kind of defining the American spirit, and this is what pushes artists in America to do things, or this is part of it. I think this is kind of the backbone of it. So the United States isn't a people group. The United States isn't a specific race. It's not people located on a specific geographical location. Just because the United States is a country doesn't mean that is the United States. Because I believe that most people in the United States, or how they work, is that if they got planted somewhere else, and they weren't in another country, and it was just kind of like, nobody's claimed this land, nobody lives on this land. I think that most people in the United States would go on living according to their culture, and they just figure it out as they did before. And so you'd have this little group of people that would grow that is pretty much people from the United States. And the culture is still American. They wouldn't suddenly change their culture. And not that other countries don't change their culture, but it doesn't depend on the land. We don't have a connection to the land in the same way a lot of other countries have in the past. We don't really care that it's we don't really care that we're on the specific land. People move a lot in the United States. Also, I think that the United States is rebellious. Think of it like this way. So think of Europe as a parent, and think of the United States as a teenager. And I think you get a really good picture. And I think the United States is like, hey, Europe, go away. We don't do what you do. And I think there's certain people in the United States who definitely say, hey, we should go along with Europe. But I think that traditionally and how you see the United States is like, okay, Europe does its own thing. We really don't care about Europe. We really don't care how the rest of the world does things. We'll figure it out ourselves, which is probably what Japan does as well, going back to that. Because the United States is rebellious, one of the aspects of rebellion against Europe is they're less refined, I believe. I believe that Europe is a lot more refined. So here's an example. If you go to Europe, people dress up. People dress up in Europe, and it's like business casual, yeah, kind of like business casual. They'll have like a button-down shirt, and they'll have nice clothes on. You see this a lot. You go to the United States, and people walk around and they wear clothes that are for exercising. They'll wear exercise clothes, and you don't do that in Europe. Because the United States is just like, whatever, we really don't care. Most people in the United States really don't care. And if somebody in Europe was like, hey, like, why do you do that? Like this, you're not dressing up. You're not appropriate for public. What we would probably say, or what most people would say, is like, it doesn't really matter to me. Like I said before, the United States is more individualistic, risk-taking, and it's more optimistic. And I think that there are certain cultures, like certain things can happen in certain cultures. Okay, I don't know if something like a Nazi party can happen in the United States. I mean, maybe down the line the culture will change, but even now, I don't think anything like that could happen, because I think that the United States is just really, really individualistic, and I think there's so many people that are just willing to yell at you, which I mean, if you do something people don't like, there's bound to be people. If you're famous enough and you do something people don't like, there's bound to be people who yell at you. For example, George W. Bush, to be specific, when he was giving a speech, somebody threw a shoe at his head. Okay, so if somebody is willing to throw a shoe at the head of the president, they are definitely willing to do other stuff. Like, they're definitely willing to yell at you for stuff they don't like, especially if you have a platform. Okay, so there's going to be people who are telling you you're wrong all the time, and I'm not saying this doesn't happen in other countries. I'm just saying that there's like I said before, we're louder, more brash, and different things like that. But I think that's part of it. Being really individualistic is you're just going to express yourself in the way that you see fit. You're not going to really follow what other people tell you. And the final thing before I wrap up is there's this image I have, and it's not something I came up with, but it's a saying. But I have an image of in my head of the saying. It's the saying of build your wings on the way down. So what that means is like the image that comes to my head is somebody jumping off a cliff, and they kind of put together something so they don't die. And what that means is that it's just the risk taking of the United States. It's kind of like if you it's not everyone, and this doesn't encompass everyone, but I think there is a spirit of this in the United States where you're just like, well, I'm going to do this, and if I fail, I fail. And I think that as I was talking, like when Ricky Gervais was talking about, oh yeah, people in the United States believe they can do stuff. People in the United States don't think they're just stuck in their station or stuck in their class. People in the United States think, hey, I'm going to go try that, and I'm going to figure it out as I fall off this cliff. So that's how I'm going to wrap up. I have a quick, I thought I had a, oh yeah, I do. So I have a quick logical fallacy of the week. Our logical fallacy of the week, I believe you say a Ludic fallacy. I'm not sure how you say the word. But what it is when the outcomes of non-regulated random events can be accounted for by a statistic. So if someone is saying, oh, like, I just have the statistic, like I measure all these different things and it's a random event, and this statistic can tell me the outcome. But that's not actually the case, because what this does, what somebody does when they interact with a random statistic is they do not take into account unknown unknowns. Okay, so there's certain things they don't even know about that are happening in relation to this. For example, you could predict, so you could take statistics from pretty much every country on Earth, and you could just amass tons and tons of statistics, and then you could be like, I am going to predict the future based on these statistics. What's going to happen? And based on those statistics, you could try to predict the future, and you might get it right, but it's because of chance. The reason why you can't predict it is because you do not know everything involved with that. Think about the stock market. You could try to predict the stock market, but just because you try to predict the stock market doesn't mean you're going to get it right. You're probably going to get it right. Maybe you'll get it right and it seems like you are doing a good job, but it might be because of chance. Okay. That is the Ludick fallacy. We're going to call it Ludick. So that is, that's what my thoughts about the United States. If you disagree with me, you're very welcome to disagree. I think that's a part of individualism. Go ahead and disagree. Go ahead and think your own thoughts. That's all right with me. I guess for all of you, actually for everyone, happy 4th of July. I'm Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.